The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
It seems like every few months, the Jewish community is forced to face a long-standing issue that has been ignored. Recently, that story has been how we deal with sexual abuse and misconduct, as the story of Chaim Walder and his victims came to the forefront of Jewish debate. The fallout was swift and shocking. Yet somehow there are those in our community who still shy away from discussing these issues publicly, and some even go so far as to censor others from talking about it. That's why I invited on this week's guest, who certainly knows a thing or two about censorship.
Hi, I am Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt. I am a journalist living in New York City.
Avital is a phenomenal voice in the modern Orthodox community, as well as being highly influential outside the Jewish community, and her understanding of what is and is not considered taboo is probably unparalleled. And I'm incredibly thankful that she agreed to come on and have this discussion. All right, Avital, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a long time in the making, and I'm very glad we were able to finally get together for this type of a discussion. I invited you on here this week to discuss a topic that is related to a large variety of areas of Jewish thought and I guess Jewish discussion more accurately in today's day and age, and that is censorship. And when I say censorship, I don't mean TV censors that beep out things or anything about like what we are and aren't allowed to say, but things about how when we discuss certain topics in Judaism, how certain areas of Judaism kind of get pushed to the side, like, oh, we're not going to discuss that. And even when we get into those things, we're not going to discuss this particular thing or this particular person. And what brought this on for me was the recent situation with Chaim Walder, and a couple of things that happened to me personally and in my publication. But before I get into any of that and to any of the extended topics that will come out of that, I wanted to get your definition and your opinion of what is censorship and how is it manifested in our community.
Sure. I think the best way for me to frame this for you is to explain that this is something that I've been very passionate about for a while. And I think some people will find this uncomfortable, but I'm going to make this analogy. I come from a family of Soviet Jewish refugees. My parents left the Soviet Union in 1979. And I grew up listening to stories of journalists and writers and artists and singers who were not able to tell their full truths because it was sort of counter to the party ideology one way or another. There were obviously ways to sort of bypass it subtly, not so subtly. There were massive consequences depending on what decade you were lucky or not lucky to be living in. If you did speak out and sort of try to break through that censorship barrier. But to me, censorship is about silencing truths, silencing realities, whether it's news or opinions or views in the community that are not in a community, in any society, that are not deemed one way or another expedient for those in power.
Now, I will point out that from what I understand, when people do censor things, when people make a topic or any given person a taboo, there is kind of a well-meaningness behind it. Like they're trying to do something. They're trying to tell you that this is kind of an off limits. We don't touch that. Now, what comes out of that might not necessarily be great. It's not a great result. But let's talk about your family history since you brought it up. The things that the things that they were prohibited from discussing, the people who stopped them from discussing it had something in mind. Was it nefarious? Was it positive? What were they trying to accomplish with that censorship?
I think this is where the line, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, may come in. I think that the intentions were, it doesn't really matter, I think, actually, what their intentions were in terms of, let's say my family history, just because it's an easy and very extreme example of that. There was one intention only, and it was to maintain power for a certain group of people. In that case, that was the party elite. And if you spoke up against that, in that case, about expression of Jewish identity, or what they would call Zionism, usually, those were things that were off limits. Now, they were off limits in the name of quote unquote communism and a greater brotherly egalitarianism that the Communist Party promised, right? So if you want to call that a good intention, you could argue that, yes.
Right. So it's a good intention in their mind. So however
right?
you're going to determine that.
Yeah.
Now I want to transpose that into things that we have in our communities nowadays. I'm going to start with basically what I led with at the top of the show, and that is not necessarily specifically a situation involving Chaim Walder, but in general, how we discuss things like sexual assault and sexual misconduct in our community, kind of to the point where we have to speak in, let's all call it a lashon naki. We kind of, we don't exactly attack the situation on hand. We dance around it. We try to protect people's ears from hearing things that they may not want to hear, or we may not want them to hear. First of all, why do we do that? And second of all, what are the consequences of doing that?
So I think for the reasons for that there are some good intentions. I think number one, there is concern from some groups about traumatizing or re-traumatizing or triggering survivors of any abuse, when reading this sort of thing, right? And that's why nowadays people are sort of very conscious of this, and they will post, a trigger warning or a content warning before sharing something. So I think there is that concern, though there are ways to bypass it, namely by sort of warning people about content. Otherwise, I think in a case of Walder, there were two layers. There was the censorship issue, which is, we don't want to talk about what happened. And there's also the issue of him being a powerful, respected person in the community whom no one wanted, especially at the beginning, especially when the first round of allegations came out in Haaretz. No one wanted to believe or perpetuate. But the censorship issue is, as you say, is true, that has applied to pretty much every other single alleged abuser over the last, let's say, decade. Famous instances would be the Mashi Zahav story, and about 10 years ago with Nehemiah Weberman. Those were stories that were just as quickly dismissed, though they were not nearly, I think, as sort of powerful, mainstream, and esteemed as Chaim Walder was.
So the thing about that is that if we at this point stop mentioning his name, stop talking about him, does that kind of send the impression to other would-be abusers that we're going to sweep this under the rug? Now, before I let you answer that, there is the alternative explanation, where I know that there are some news outlets that stopped mentioning the names of mass shooters because we don't want to give them the attention that they deserve. I would say that in this case, it might be a little different, because I don't think the people that are perpetuating these abuses are looking for attention. They're trying to do this under the radar. So
right. It's
my
the
question,
opposite. They're looking to stay in the shadows.
Yeah, exactly. So my question would stand is, like, if somebody else who isn't a Chaim Walder, isn't of that stature, sees that this is what happens to him, well, we kind of just pretend like he never existed. We burn his books. We stop talking about him. We just erase him from our memory. Like, if that's the worst that could happen to me, is that so bad? Like, oh, they're just not going to talk about me forever.
Yeah, I definitely think it's an important deterrent. It's obviously not foolproof, and the example of that would be looking at instances of this in secular media in the wider, Western society. Certainly, abuse happens even when it is reported on. But I think there's less of a culture of it being swept under the rug, especially around sort of powerful celebrity people. And we're also, by the way, talking about abuse outside of families. Inside families, I think the story is very different. which is, as I understand, the vast majority of cases in the Frum community,
Right.
unfortunately. So when you're talking about someone like a Walder or a Meshi Zahav, a Harvey Weinstein, it's certainly a deterrent. And we know that to be true, number one. But I think what's even more important is that it validates victims / survivors' experiences to read about this, for them to understand that they're not alone, right? And that was really the power of the Me Too movement. And whatever you want to say about that, and it was, I think, very heavily politicized afterwards. And certainly, I think there were some quite a few stories where I think it was overplayed, but and the essence of that movement was very powerful, was showing that this is endemic. And I think that that is really important when we as a community talk about abuse, is that it's not just about the perpetrator. For me, it's less and less so. It's really about the people who go through this experience and validating them and seeing them and saying that we are with you and that we are going to do everything possible to not let this happen again.
I do want to touch on, because we're doing it right now, what I'm about to say, we're doing it right now. We're calling it abuse, but that's not what it is. It's not the same thing. There's a difference between abuse and sexual abuse. There's a difference between assault and sexual assault. And
right.
I want to know if it is, and if it is, how important it is to actually use those terms, because we kind of, as religious figures, as members of a highly religious group of people, we try not to use these terms. We don't want to say them. But is it important to make sure that we use the correct terminology? If so, why? And if not, why not?
It's a great question. I want to say that I'm not sure what the right answer is, and I would probably defer to a psychologist who works in this area in the importance of using the correct terminology. I imagine it is important. In general, language matters. The reason I am not medactic, I'm not overly careful about using the word sexual abuse, and I'm okay with just saying abuse, is that I do think, exactly as you said, there are certain sort of etiquettes and norms in our community. And I think some of them are, you always have to kind of pick your battles. And for me, that's something that doesn't really bother me as much. And if that is the thing that allows us to talk about it more freely and more comfortably, then let it be,
Right. Exactly. Now, I do want to ask you this, because you and I are kind of embedded in the modern Orthodox community. And when you think about censorship, and forget about Judaism for a second, but in general, the more orthodox someone is in their thoughts, the further extreme someone is, the more likely I think they are to be to try to censor certain ideas and certain thoughts. So now bring that back to our community. Do you find that there is a censorship issue that is more, let's say, endemic in the more Haredi community, or is that something that happens closer to home for the two of us in the modern Orthodox communities?
I think you would be surprised by how frequently things are swept under the rug in the modern Orthodox community. And I think there's a certain schadenfreude that I hear sometimes among modern Orthodox Jews talking about Haredi Jews, saying, well, in that community, this is a big problem. We have it all figured out. There are certainly differences in approaches and in the way that communities handle things. Both communities do have organizations, it must be said, that try to deal with this issue, some for better, some for worse. But overall, unfortunately, I would say that in the last few years, I have seen quite a few instances in the modern Orthodox community where no one wanted to deal with an alleged perpetrator. I will also say that I don't think the quote unquote media in the modern Orthodox community is any better or any more open-minded. Yes, we will have, pictures of women appearing there, but that's it. We don't really have, I don't believe it's more, it pushes the envelope more than one would see in the Haredi community overall, which I know sounds like a very strong statement, but I do stand by it. And I don't want to go through like names and point fingers because that's not the point, but I've definitely seen quite a few failures, I think, on that front.
So of course, I 100% agree with you saying, but I've noticed that that's not necessarily, specific to the modern Orthodox community. What I have noticed is that any community or any group of people, political, spiritual, religious, even something like athletics, it's always going to be like, that's a problem that they have. We don't have that problem here. It's something that I think is more based in humanity than is in orthodoxy. That it's always something. I always acknowledge a problem that they have. It's not the problem that I find in my group of friends, in my circles. Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head, that we definitely should be looking more inward when we discuss, especially topics as serious as this, as to what we can do about it. Before I go on to anything else, because I do have a couple of other areas to touch on, is there anything else that you want to talk about in terms of the censorship of how we deal with sexual abuse in our community?
Yeah, I think the last thing I would just add is that there have been some quote unquote editorials and blog posts initially after Walder committed suicide, that were sort of like very, either there was like blatant sort of denial that we're not going to get into this is not on us to deal with, etc. Or there were pieces that were written that were sort of like, this is really a problem, we as a community have to deal with it, etc. Most of those pieces did not name the perpetrator in the story. Most of them were sort of very, I would say, would traffic in platitudes and not really sort of offer concrete solutions that have been, there were some solutions offered, but they were historically have been very clearly proven wrong. So I think overall, the censorship goes hand in hand with this sort of larger issue with the way that we talk about issues in the community, which is like, oh, we have to start an organization. Oh, we have to create a new Besdin. A lot of these pundits are not, I think, as I understand, are not attuned to the history of this, and it would behoove them to speak with activists and those who have been studying this for years and years and years and know what works and what doesn't work. So I think that, and in general, it's sort of, to me, that all those blog posts and articles were sort of felt to me very lacking in, in action, and that they were just sort of like, people felt like they have to say that. But tachlis, like, what are we doing? Like, there are dozens of Chaim Walders walking around our communities today. And I say that as a journalist and as a Rebbitzin, as someone who is well aware of these individuals, and of the allegations against them. And those in power are not doing anything about it. So I think that there should be urgency about this, and I'm not seeing that urgency, and I think that's what's really disappointing.
So a couple of things on what you just said. So first of all, of course, there are, I wrote that in an article recently, that for every Chaim Walder, there's a bunch of people out there that are doing the same thing, but even if they get caught and punished, they won't get the press that he got, because they're not who he was. The people are much more anonymous than him, but no less dangerous. And the thing you said about pundits is 100% correct, in that I'm also a pundit. I also have a column, and pundits often like to yell and scream about certain problems without offering any solutions. That's one of the issues with modern day media. Actually, the reason the kind of the impetus behind this conversation was that I wrote an article for my publication that was censored, because I wasn't allowed to use terms like sexual abuse. I wasn't allowed to use Chaim Walder's name in it. And for whatever reason, my publication said I have to change it. So I actually had to rework it. And credit to my publication, the Queen's Jewish Link, they allowed me to publish something that was not only critical of censorship, they allowed me to publish something that was critical of them, of the paper in the actual article. I was highly critical of doing of the paper, that, and they allowed me to publish that in my own paper. But you are correct in the fact that while I was ranting and raving about problems, the only solution that I may have offered is to stop censoring, which isn't really going to be a solution to stop this from happening again. If anything, it might be a solution to help educate other people, but it wasn't really. It was more of a getting a frustration out, and I think that's what a lot of us pundits do on a regular basis.
Right. So let's just take a step back for a second and consider what were the two sort of strikes that took Wilder down, if you really boil it down. Number one was investigative journalism, and number two was a Besdin that was willing to take him on and willing to listen to testimonies of victims. By the way, behind both of those strikes was a group of young Haredi women activists who knew that this was a problem and who sort of helped coordinate this. So those are concrete things that could be done. But I mean, I'm obviously biased. I'm a journalist, but to my mind, the only thing that even pushed for the Besdin to happen was Haaretz. In the end of the day, were two reporters who invested months of their lives and risked a lot to tell the story. And that is something that does not exist in the Frum community, right? So like censorship and commentary, that's like, that's kind of the smaller chunk of the problem. The big chunk of the problem is there's no one doing any reporting on the Frum community. I mean, yeah, you'll see a Frum magazine publish an article about a quote unquote issue like, I don't know, tech addiction or like drunk alcoholism, like a decade after that became an issue.
Right.
That's not investigative reporting. That's not a finish. We don't have anyone doing that sort of work inside the community currently. And if you do want to do that sort of work, like myself, you have to go outside the community to find a place for it. So I think that sort of censorship is even more dangerous than the censorship of commentary.
And as a columnist, people often ask me if I'm a journalist. I am not. I'm a columnist. I'm not an investigative anything. I have the utmost respect and admiration for people who spend their lives doing these things and digging into these stories. And I think the reason that we don't find that more in the Frum community is because of the vast expense that comes with it. The only places that could really afford to have investigative journalism are the people with a lot of money. I don't think that we have a lot of that in Frum press these days. There is a lot of money, but I don't know if there's enough to support the amount that it would take to have investigative journalism. It would be a phenomenal thing for us to have. But yeah, it's so hard, and all the credit to you guys who do these things. And of course, we're all appreciative. Half the things that we know today about the goings on of the underground is because of investigative journalism. I think like the other part is because of police work and detective. But that's basically what you're doing. You're the detectives without having to make an arrest. What I do want to shift now a little bit to some of the other areas that we kind of don't censor, and why do we think that these areas don't receive the same type of treatment that sexual abuse does? And when we talk about things that that are taboos in our society, in our Frum life, we really, this is one of the major ones. But there are other areas that are also terrible according to our values, according to our Torah values, that we kind of just accept these days. Number one, easy one is Chilul Shabbos. It is so easy for people to call out Chilul Shabbos, and it's also easy for people in the Frum community to accept others that are Mechalel Shabbos. Why is Chilul Shabbos something that is so much easier to discuss and talk about than what we have been talking about until now?
An interesting question. I mean, I'm curious which specific examples you're referring to, but I don't want to get into it with you on the recording. Um, but
I'll make it more
yeah,
specific without citing specific examples.
sure.
If a person walks into shul and they're known to have been Machal Shabbos, maybe they
Oh,
won't get
yes.
an aliyah, but they'll be welcomed. They'll get a seat in the shul. They will have no problem, fitting in with society. Just everybody knows, all right, that guy or that lady, they don't keep Shabbos. Maybe you just shouldn't eat in their house. Whereas someone who is known to be who has been suspected of committing atrocious acts,
Right.
if we sweep it under the rug and we don't kind of acknowledge it, they're kind of melded into society. We kind of allow them to continue doing what they were doing. They'll get the aliyah. They'll be able to sponsor a kiddush. They'll get an invite for lunch at some places, and people will go to their house. So why the difference in those two areas?
I mean, I do think there is an Indian of ben adam l'makom, ben adam l'chavero. There's a difference, and I will say that, obviously I'm, very influenced by my surroundings and serving a community in Manhattan. Shabbos is like kind of a personal question in certain communities. In certain communities that affiliate as modern Orthodox, it's sort of like a personal question. So yeah, so I feel like for me that's not it obviously really really highly depends on the community you're talking about, the milieu within which this social dynamic is taking place. um in a community where there's sort of no questions asked, I understand why that is so, in that it's seen as a personal decision, and you don't want to alienate someone who could return to keeping Shabbos or come to keeping Shabbos for the first time in their lives. So I think that is sensitive.
All right, so
Yeah.
let me change the topic then. Let me change the analogy. Someone who commits a white collar crime. So the difference between the way we treat someone who has committed a white collar crime and maybe was even, tried, sentenced, found guilty, the whole thing, and now they're out of
Sure.
prison. So the way we treat that person versus the way we treat the person accused of other misconduct.
I think they're both treated pretty well in the Frum community. That's the truth. And I think it really does depend on the case in terms of the white collar crime. There are instances. Our communities have never been immune from crime. There have always been criminals in our midst. And I think the notion, which I think a lot of the censorship, quote unquote, propaganda media has created, is that like Kulan and Tzaddikim, like that's not true. Like there have always been criminals and mafiosos and gangsters and abusers and thieves in the Jewish community. And if you ever study, Shelot Tshuvot, the response of Rabbanim over the centuries, you see that come through very evidently. So I think it does again depend on the case, and there are some times where someone has done shuva, in terms of financial crimes, and have sort of served, and that doesn't mean they shouldn't be allowed back in shul necessarily. That also does not mean that person needs to get a cover of a magazine, right? Or be revered and honored with all the kivudim at a dinner or something of that sort. I think you want to sort of differentiate between the two very clearly. Yeah, I mean, in general, unfortunately, I think financial crimes are much more common than we realize inside the Frum community. And that is true regarding in for-profit businesses and non-for-profit organizations. A lot of this is happening all around us, and we sort of just let it happen. So I don't have a good answer for you. I do wonder, again, for me, the question always comes back to this question of, well, where is journalism that uncovers this, that does the work of being that disinfectant? The sunlight is the best disinfectant, according to Judge Brandeis. And I do wonder where it is.
So there are certain areas that we've discussed so far that are specific to within the Frum community. I don't think anybody's doing investigative journalism on people that are Machal Shabbos. I don't think that's going to be something
No,
that people are
no.
going to be interested in reading, nor is it probably appropriate. But how much of the journalism that needs to be done, or the policing that needs to be done, has to come from within our community versus somewhere else? So if a person is caught committing a white collar crime, if a person is caught committing some sort of a sexual abuse crime, is that the responsibility of us within the community to investigate that, or is that just something that we say, hey, let's report this to the appropriate authorities and we'll let them deal with it? That's my job, is to make sure that the right people know it, versus having someone within our community dig deeper.
It's a great question. Usually, I mean, what happens in the wider, world is generally there's just certain stages. There's the initial research and investigation that is done by either a reporter or a concerned citizen, or someone who sort of is a whistleblower within an organization, let's say. And then the moment there is some sort of evidence of wrongdoing, that is passed on to the authorities. The reason I think the authorities are really important, which I think has gotten a short shrift in the last month, 2 months of conversation about abuse in the Frum community, is that I think we often, there's this inclination, especially in more right-wing communities, but the truth is I see this in the modern Orthodox community as well, is that we are going to take this and deal with this internally. Our Rabbanim will deal with it, our Bataydin will deal with it, the principal, this, that. The reality is it's extremely hard to deal with those sorts of crimes at those sorts of levels internally. They are almost never solved internally. And not only that, I want us to take a moment and consider the position that puts community leaders in. And I think it's an unfair position. And I say this as a waif of a rabbi. Like, very few rabbis feel secure enough in their positions, in their futures, in their just literally sometimes there's concerns about physical safety in taking on some of these gangsters, right? So why are we putting the onus on them? Why are we putting the onus on them? Like, I don't think that's right either.
So what do you do as a person in the community? What do you do as a community leader? Because I could ask you that question as from both of those positions. I think you can find yourself as in any given time as one of those people, community leader or just a member of the community. So if you're saying that we shouldn't be putting that onus on the community leaders, who should I be putting that onus on? And if you're a community leader, what do I do once that onus has been put on me?
I think the bottom line is to go to the authorities. And my point is that it's in the community leaders' own interest to support reporting to the authorities, because it protects them from having to be, the ones carrying this burden on their shoulders too, right? And I think those who are sort of calling on internal solutions don't understand the extent to which how badly this can go. And also, I think some of them, unfortunately, it's a little bit of a cop-out. They think that these things just need to be solved inside, just like all problems need to be solved inside, just like the handling of COVID had to be handled inside, or educational issues have to be handled inside. Unfortunately, the reality is sometimes you do need someone to come in from the outside to help you clean up your house. That's it.
Here's the thing. You said these things have to be handled inside. And as you were saying these things have to be handled inside, I could picture people in their mind saying to themselves, oh, she's talking about this community, not my community. Right. Everybody who was thinking, not everybody, I shouldn't say that, I shouldn't disparage my entire audience, but a lot of people who were listening to you saying that, they pictured a particular community in their minds when they said that. And the point that I think we need to drive home here is that don't think that these issues are exclusive to other communities. They're endemic in all of these communities. Maybe the scale is different. Maybe some communities are better at certain things and worse at other things, but they're there. They're there regardless of where you think you are, of where you are politically, of where you are religiously, of how close physically you are to your neighbors, whether you live in a city, where you live in the suburbs, or you live in a rural area. All these things are there. It just where to find them. I have a question for you as a journalist. At what point do you approach the authorities? You're working on a story. It's taking you months, and all of a sudden you think, okay, this is something that I need to get the police involved. At what point do you go approach the authorities? Do you worry that might damage your story? How does that work with you just on an internal level?
It's a good question. It depends on how much evidence you've amassed. So, if you have a smoking gun, I believe that is certainly enough. My contacts in various authorities and agencies have told me that you don't even need that much. Meaning, if you have a hunch about something really bad is going on, you should make that call. Now, when this involves abuse, this is extremely sexual abuse. This gets very complicated, of course. If it's a child, if it involves a minor, you call the authorities without a question. If it is someone who is an adult, if that's much more complicated, and they have to sort of, obviously they have to give their permission for that to be done, and they have to be ready to testify.
So the last question I want to ask you is, what can we do to combat censorship? Is there something that we should be doing? Is there something that we should be pushing for? And if so, what is that?
I think at this point, the only answer to that is social media, to be honest. I don't think this is ever going to be fixed in the current publications as they stand. Their revenue models do not allow for that sort of frank discourse or any sort of real journalism. So I think we sort of have to remove our rosy colored glasses, that those are things that, again, are going to be fixed inside, and sort of think creatively around those institutions, around those realities, and figuring out what are independent channels of information.
It's funny. This is the second podcast that I've done where somebody actually promoted social media. The first one was how it's impacted the Aguna crisis, and absolutely, it's another area where the kind of we turned a blind eye to until it's been shown on.
Consider for a second, just to bring back to Russia, because I think it's a really good example. But Alexei Navalny became this massive activist with a huge following because he knew how to use social media to really mobilize the masses. Now, it doesn't always work, and look at the Arab Spring, that kind of failed. But certainly it can be used in the right. If it's used correctly, it could be used in a very constructive way.
I would say in the last 10 years, the people who have been the most successful have done it through social media. The people with the biggest, loudest voices. Exactly, 100% agree. Before I let you go, I want to give my audience a chance to find out where can they read your work. What publications are you in?
Sure. Right now I'm writing for a bunch of different publications. So the best thing to do is to follow me on social media. Now that we just spoke about it. My handle on Twitter and on Instagram is Avital Rachel. I'm not yet on TikTok. Please don't force me.
And of course, we're going to link to all of those on all social medias. We are also not on TikTok. Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt, thank you so much for joining me this week. I appreciate the time that you've given us, and good luck to you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
My thanks to Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt for joining us this week. One of the most poignant points that Avital made is the need to have more investigative journalists working for our media outlets. Opinion columns and reporters are one thing, but for positive change to be made within our community, someone is going to have to get their hands dirty. We can't always rely on the outside world to resolve our problems. I hope you found this discussion enlightening, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Until next time, Kol Tov.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Sreli Pikus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg. Follow us on Facebook at The Jewish Living Podcast and on Twitter and Instagram at Jewish_living. You can also email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queen's Jewish Link.
Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt. Try that again. I'm just gonna do it Avital because I've always. How do you pronounce that middle part of your name?
Chizhik.
Chizhik. Okay.